The auditorium lights cast a sterile white glow across the semicircular hearing room, filled with polished wood, sharp microphones, and a sea of tightly folded arms and furrowed brows. A special session of the House Senate Oversight Committee had convened to review the systemic failures in education funding and racial disparities in academic outcomes. It was supposed to be procedural, another toothless round of rhetorical exercises. But when Senator J.D. Vance, flanked by his usual cohort of ideological allies, requested a joint interview session with Representative Jasmine Crockett, the tone shifted immediately. The cameras were already rolling when Vance leaned forward, fixing his gaze on Crockett across the long table with the smugness of a man certain of his next headline. "Representative Crockett," he began, his tone coated in condescension. "Since we're discussing educational meritocracy and opportunity, I think it's only fair to ask, what were your college grades like? Were you at the top of your class, or did you benefit from the same leniency you're now advocating for others?" The room tensed. Even the interns stopped typing. Crockett blinked once, then folded her hands calmly, but beneath the composure was a silence so taut it hummed. Her voice, when it came, was soft but clear, slicing through the tension like glass. "Senator, I'm happy to answer your question, but let's be honest about why you asked it." She leaned in slightly. "You're not curious about my GPA. You're trying to delegitimize my presence at this table. You're implying that my degrees, my career, and my intellect are footnotes in someone else's policy of charity." Vance opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't pause. "I graduated magna cum laude from the University of Houston. Top 10% in my law school class. I didn't get there on a legacy name or a fancy prep school education. I got there grinding through night shifts, carpooling 3 buses, and tutoring just to cover groceries." She let the silence fill the space after her words like a slow-building storm. "So, no, Senator, I didn't just earn my grades. I survived for them." The murmurs began, a mix of stunned admiration and nervous discomfort from the panelists. Vance tilted his head, unfazed. "Then why?" he pressed. "Do you support lowering academic standards in poor-performing schools? If you did it the hard way, why not expect others to rise to the same bar?" There was a flash in her eyes, something ancient, defiant, maternal. "You think it's the same bar?" she shot back. "You think what I had to overcome just to reach that bar was the same as what a wealthy suburban kid faces? We don't start from the same place, Senator. You know that. You wrote about it in your book, Hillbilly Elegy, wasn't it? You said poverty crushes people. You described your own trauma like a badge. So why, when someone who doesn't look like you wears it, do you call it an excuse?" Vance stiffened, suddenly unsure of his footing. "I believe in responsibility," he said. "In accountability. I don't think we help people by pretending their choices don't matter." Crockett shook her head slowly. "You confuse choices with chances. You had a grandmother who saved you. I had a system that expected me to fail." She gestured around the hearing room. "You all love stories of redemption, as long as they're white and rural. But when it's black and urban, suddenly it's identity politics. Suddenly it's handouts. You don't ask yourself why my district's schools don't have working HVAC systems, why our textbooks are 20 years old, why our counselors double as janitors. You just ask what my grades were." A low gasp rippled across the room. Vance's smirk had vanished. The senator leaned back in his chair, but his voice remained cold, calculated. "You're playing the victim, Jasmine. You're smart, yes. Articulate, obviously. But this isn't about your story. It's about policy, and policy doesn't care about feelings." Crockett stood slowly, not waiting for permission. "Then maybe policy is the problem," she said, her voice rising, not in volume but in force. "Because I am the policy. I'm the result of every budget cut, every standardized test, every cop placed in a classroom instead of a counselor. I am what happens when you force kids to survive instead of thrive." She walked around the table, her heels echoing like a judge's gavel. You want to reduce me to grades? Fine, here's the grade. F for every time you confuse empathy with weakness. F for every time you prop up bootstraps like they were made available to everyone. F for pretending you're own. Pain is noble and mine is negligent. She stopped just inches from him, her eyes searing into his. You didn't ask that question to learn. You asked it to remind America that I don't belong here. But you're wrong. I do belong. And the fact that I terrify you, that's how. I know it. She turned, leaving the room in stunned silence, the cameras still rolling, the echo of her final words hovering like smoke in a courtroom. Vance sat motionless, eyes blank. The brutal question he thought would humiliate her now hanging like a noose around his own credibility. As Crockett walked out of the room, her stride deliberate and unyielding, the echoes of the confrontation reverberated through the halls of the Capitol. She could feel the weight of the moment, but there was no satisfaction in it. There was only the anticipation of what would come next, the fallout. She didn't need to look behind her to know Vance was seething, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling beneath his own arrogance. The cameras had caught every word, every inflection, and now it would be on the evening news, dissected by pundits, weaponized by opposition forces. But Crockett had never been afraid of the spotlight. It had always been a double-edged sword. Back. In the green room, the phone calls began almost immediately. Staffers, aides, even reporters, everyone wanting a piece of the firestorm. But Crockett's mind was elsewhere. She could still hear Vance's voice in her head, the arrogance, the disdain. And yet, despite the humiliation he must have felt, she knew it wasn't over. He wouldn't back down. He couldn't. To do so would be to expose his own hypocrisy, to show that he wasn't really interested in policy reform or education equity. He was just another figurehead for a status quo that only thrived on division, and that was something she couldn't let go unchecked. The next morning, Vance did what he had to do. With the press waiting outside his office, he issued a statement, a typical deflection aimed at reasserting his control over the narrative. Representative Crockett's outburst yesterday was nothing more than a diversion from the real issues at hand. My question wasn't about her grades. It was about her policies and whether they serve the people she claims to represent. His words were calculated, practiced, but in his eyes the exhaustion was clear. The anger hadn't dissipated. In fact, it had only intensified. The more Crockett's voice lingered in the air, the more he knew he had miscalculated. Later that afternoon, Vance found himself standing before a group of his most trusted political allies, preparing for a strategy meeting. His team had been up all night, analyzing every angle of the confrontation. They had anticipated some backlash, but not the tidal wave that Crockett's words had unleashed. His approval ratings were dipping, and social media was ablaze with hashtags like #OffF or Vance and Crockett crushes it. The room was tense, filled with murmurs of concern. But Vance, as always, put on his game face. This is just another attack from the left. They'll twist this. They'll make me the villain. But we can't let them control the narrative. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. We need to remind America what I stand for. Real meritocracy. Real responsibility. The words felt hollow in his mouth, but he couldn't afford to falter now. Meanwhile, Crockett was standing before a different set of eyes filled with hope, with resolve. In a small office in the Capitol, she met with a group of activists, community leaders, and educators who had been following her lead. The mood was electric, full of the kind of energy that came from knowing they had just exposed a massive crack in the system. Crockett's phone buzzed on the desk, a steady stream of notifications, but she didn't look at it. She looked at the people in the room, the faces that mirrored the same struggles, the same hunger for change. This isn't about me, it's about us. She didn't need to elaborate further. They understood. As the meeting ended, she stepped outside into the blinding sunlight of Washington, D.C. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of what was to come. She knew Vance wasn't done. He would strike back. He would continue to twist her words, to question her motives, to try to reduce her to a caricature of a politician who didn't belong in a room full of serious people. But Crockett had been underestimated before, and every time she had risen. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And for once, the question wasn't whether she could survive the storm. The real question was how many people would be standing with her when the dust settled. In the next few days, the media cycle spun wildly. Vance's camp tried to redirect attention back to his so-called policy positions, but it wasn't enough. Every time he appeared on television, it seemed as if Crockett's shadow loomed larger. His own colleagues began to distance themselves, unwilling to be caught in the fallout. Even some of his staunchest supporters questioned his approach. The quiet, unsettling truth began to bubble to the surface. Vance had underestimated the power of one woman's words, the sheer force of a narrative not built on punditry or ideology, but on lived experience. And then, just as the narrative was beginning to shift against him, Vance found himself in an unexpected encounter. It was late one evening, and he was walking through the Capitol halls, lost in thought, when he ran into Crockett again. This time, there was no confrontation, no sharp words or pointed accusations. She simply looked at him, her eyes calm, almost pitying. "You didn't really think you could take me down with that, did you?" she asked, her voice gentle, almost amused. Vance opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he just nodded, defeated, for the first time in a long while. Crockett turned and walked away without another word, leaving him standing there, questioning everything he thought he knew about power and about the woman who had just destroyed him with a single, well-timed question. The viral momentum had only grown. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's takedown were remixed into TikToks, turned into classroom teaching tools, even dissected in college media ethics courses. Late-night hosts had their laughs at J.D. Vance's expense, but beneath the humor was something far more dangerous for the senator, a fundamental shift in public perception. He wasn't just wrong, he looked small. In contrast, Crockett emerged as a force of intellect and fury, the embodiment of righteous resistance in a world exhausted by polite cowardice. But even she understood how fickle that spotlight could be. So while the internet cheered, she was working. Drafting legislation with a small coalition of representatives, progressive, moderate, even a few libertarian-leaning ones, focused on reshaping the federal framework for public education equity. "If I'm going to get dragged through the fire," she told her aides, "then I'm lighting a match of my own." J.D. Vance, meanwhile, was spiraling. Not publicly, he maintained the mask, the crisp tie, the confident drawl. But inside, it was a war zone. He was losing control of his image, of the cultural narrative he'd helped shape since Hillbilly Elegy made him a household name. That book, once his shield, had become a club used against him. People read it now and saw hypocrisy, not humility. And worse, the younger generation didn't care. They saw a man who used pain to climb a ladder, then pulled it up behind him. "You're getting wrecked out there," his communications director whispered one night as they walked through the tunnels beneath the Capitol. "You need to flip this. Fast." But Vance knew the truth. There was no flipping it. Not when your opponent had turned the question you thought would shame her into a national rallying cry. Not when your own party was subtly repositioning around you, floating new voices to the press, less combative, more unifying. In a desperate attempt to regain footing, Vance arranged an exclusive interview on Meet the Nation, hoping to frame the confrontation with Crockett as a moment of miscommunication, a clash between two Americans who both care deeply, even if we disagree. He rehearsed the lines, softened his tone. But when the cameras started rolling, the interviewer didn't follow the script. "Senator?" she asked. What message do you think it sends to challenge a black woman's credentials on national television with a question about her grades? Vance froze. He had prepped for policy, not race, not history, not the raw, human context of the wound he'd opened. "I didn't mean it that way," he stammered. "I was trying to—" "You were trying to what?" the interviewer pushed. "Draw a line between legitimate and illegitimate success? Isn't that the very thing your own life disproves?" The silence that followed was worse than yelling. It was the sound of power eroding in real time. The final blow came not from a lawmaker or a journalist, but from someone entirely unexpected. J.D. Vance's former mentor, the retired Senator Rob Portman, who broke his post-political silence. With a searing op-ed titled, "This Isn't the J.D. I Knew." In it, he wrote, "We taught J.D. to listen before speaking, to understand before judging." The question he asked Representative Crockett wasn't policy, it was prejudice, dressed in Ivy League vocabulary. It hit like a hammer. Vance's phone exploded. Allies stopped returning calls. His speaking engagements were quietly canceled. In the chamber, he became a shadow. Still there, still voting, but no longer central to the conversation. Meanwhile, Crockett stood in a press conference flanked by educators and students from across the country. "This is not revenge," she said. "This is resurrection, of truth, of justice, of the America they keep pretending doesn't exist." She paused, then added, "I didn't just answer that question, I rewrote it." With that, she walked off stage. No smile, no wave. Just the quiet, stunning gravity of a woman who had turned a trap into a triumph, and left the man who built it buried beneath the weight of his own miscalculation.